Kevin Durant will not be a member of the Memphis Grizzlies this coming season. We're going to debate over whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another installment of Locked On Grizzlies. I am one of your hosts, Joe Mullinax, joined by my co-host, the wonderful, the talented, the very busy, but always making time to chat with me, or at least doing our best to make time to chat here in the dog days of the NBA offseason. Mr. Damichael, how are you doing, sir?
Joe, I can't complain, man. Things are great on my end. It's NBA offseason, quote unquote, but a lot is happening right now. And more than anything, the NBA never sleeps. There's Kevin Durant, there's Donovan Mitchell, and then there's these sneaky things that'll sneak up on you. And then before you know it, training camp is going to be underway because we're getting closer and closer. These pro-am tournaments across the country are starting to come to an end. We saw the Drew League just ended. Pro-ams just everywhere are ending. Jamal Crawford's crossover league is getting close to an end as well. So it's almost time for the real hoops, Joe.
It is almost time for the real hoops. Very excited for that. But before we get to all that, let's get into our episode here. And I want to thank you, and of course, Damichael does as well, for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcast. Check us out on YouTube, all sorts of different places that you can get Locked On Grizzlies. Thank you for making us your first listen every chance that you get to download an episode or stream an episode of Locked On Grizzlies. A bit of news, just like that, Damichael, came down like a sudden swoop, like a sword or a guillotine to the hopes and dreams of Kevin Durant to Memphis lovers everywhere. Adrian Wojnarowski of ESPN, followed by Shams Charania of The Athletic, the two most foremost breakers of NBA news. Kevin Durant met with ownership, met with Sean Marks, the GM, met with Steve Nash, the head coach. Sounds as if there will not be any Kevin Durant trade. Doesn't sound like they're in love with each other. It doesn't necessarily seem like they're going to, get all kissy face, renew their vows, so to speak. But it does seem like somewhere along the way, they somehow convinced KD to not want to leave Brooklyn anymore. And that's arguably best case scenario for the Nets. It's an interesting situation that, again, I when I read the release, it read more like we're not going to get what we think we deserve for Kevin Durant. They're not going to be in a position to pursue a trade. We're kind of stuck with each other.
Yeah. First, Joe, I want to start off with your "we're not in love with each other" reference. I'm a big fan of love over here. So let's look at it like this.
Shout out to love. Real quick, just shout out to love. I think everybody can agree with that.
Shout out to love. Shout out to all of the lovers, out there.
Absolutely.
Don't let anyone convince you that love isn't healthy for you. And with that being said, think of this Brooklyn Nets situation as, yes, you described it perfectly. They're not in love with each other, but it's like an old married couple. It's like, you know what? We got to work this thing out. You're signed to a 4-year contract. Durant is. We got to work this thing out because at the end of the day, the Nets feel that no team is going to match their outrageous price. And as we talked about on the last episode, I mean, why should they settle? When you have one of the best players in the world with 4 years left on the deal, you have no reason to settle. But, Joe, with that news coming out, there's a big shift going on in the NBA right now. We had heard just over the past month, a lot of teams were putting their rosters on hold. A lot of teams were kind of tactically not making big decisions to keep themselves in the race for Kevin Durant. And now that sweepstakes over, I feel like a big just rush could come around the NBA, and that impacts the team that we cover, Joe.
It absolutely could. Whether it's with the commercial appeal there in Memphis, like you do as the Grizzlies beat writer, my experience covering the Grizzlies for almost a decade as site manager and and a writer over at SB Nation's GrizzlyBearBlues.com, we have a perspective on this team that makes what comes next unique. And I know we'll talk about that towards the end of the episode, because now Memphis is not being hindered by these potential KD rumors. There's no more what if, right? What if Kevin Durant actually could be acquired? What if they could actually bring him to the Grizzlies, and not just bring him to the Grizzlies like we've talked about? What if somehow, by some stroke of genius or blind, dumb luck, they were able to do it without sending Jaren Jackson Jr. or Desmond Bane? Now we don't have to talk about that anymore. It was good content for the dog days of the NBA offseason, but you can start thinking about what comes next. But before we get to that, Damichael, I'm curious as to your perspective on what comes next for the NBA at large, because the Grizzlies can still play a large role in that. Danny Green can now be aggregated into larger trades. His expiring contract that is not fully guaranteed, so teams can waive him and save $6 million. Obviously, Memphis has multiple expiring deals. They have all those draft picks still, multiple young players. If they wanted to get involved in a trade, maybe not necessarily for Donovan Mitchell, because I don't know that makes sense within the scope and scheme of what the Grizzlies are trying to do. A 7-foot scorer from anywhere made a lot more sense. Mitchell is not that. I'm curious as to how much activity do you think we'll see in these next couple of weeks? Do you think the floodgates will open? Do you think Donovan Mitchell is a New York Knick by the end of the week? Or do you think the NBA is still kind of coming to terms with this post-KD no-trade reality?
Yeah, I think right now the league is coming to terms. The reality is a lot of these guys, GMs and front office guys, this is the only month, usually August is the month where they are, quote unquote, getting some type of downtime. Right. So I think this is when they're a little less aggressive than normal and things like that. And with all that being said, I think the only thing we wait for, and I think we're going to talk about this a little bit more later as well, is the Donovan Mitchell impact now. He's quickly assumes the head chair and the guy who people are most expecting to be traded at some point. And also pertaining to the Grizzlies, from an aggressiveness standpoint, Joe, we might not see it right now. I know, historically speaking, under this regime, Locked On Grizzlies viewers, we're very familiar with the fact that they have not made deals at the deadline. But things are changing with this team. This isn't the same team from the past. The Grizzlies are in a top-tier contender right now, and they may have to make that type of move. Those contracts that you mentioned could be very valuable trading pieces at a deadline where a team can hold on to that player for half a season rather than picking up that contract for a full year. Some of those players that the Grizzlies have on expiring. So that's another thing to watch as well. It doesn't happen right now. It could be a big move that's made later, January, February, closer to the deadline, as injuries and just natural basketball things happen throughout the season. So I think we just got to slow pay it a little bit from the Grizzlies' perspective. But from the NBA perspective, a lot of teams just got a pretty much better idea of how they can manage their rosters going forward. There had to be about 5 teams that figured they were in that Kevin Durant sweepstakes.
Yeah, and again, like we've talked about, the fact that the Memphis Grizzlies could realistically say they were one of those 5, right? They were in that mix. There was potential there for them to realistically put together a package that could have acquired Kevin Durant. And they were the number 2 seed in the Western Conference last year, the second best record in the entire NBA in the regular season. That is staggering to say, and it's a wonderful reality that these Grizzlies get to experience. So I know that here in a moment, we're going to talk about why this may not be the worst thing ever, right? Like why this might be a positive thing that Memphis fell through in the cracks of this trade possibility. And we'll get to that here in a moment. But first, I want to make sure that I give you a scenario that's fairly serious. You're hanging out with some friends and putting back a few drinks. A few becomes a few too many. As the evening comes to an end and people start to head out, you think of calling for a ride. Nah, you live by. You can make it home nearby. You can make it home okay. It's no big deal. what are the odds you'll get pulled over anyway? And even so, what's the worst that could happen? Your insurance goes up, you lose your license, you lose your job, you total your car, you kill someone. Everyone knows about the risks of driving drunk. The results are tragic and often deadly. However, that still doesn't stop everyone from getting behind the wheel under the influence. That's why police officers are out there right now looking for impaired drivers on our roads to save lives. So if you think you're okay to drive after a few drinks, think again. Play it safe, plan ahead to get a ride. It only takes one mistake to change your life or someone else's forever. Drive sober or get pulled over. Damichael, a sobering reality for these Grizzlies that they're not acquiring one of the very best players in the history of the NBA in Kevin Durant, or at the very least, one of the very best scorers in the history of the NBA in Kevin Durant. I am going to pose to you, and I know we're going to have a bit of a debate in this segment. I think this is the best thing that could have happened for the Memphis Grizzlies, that they didn't acquire Kevin Durant. And here's why. I am of the belief that they have, as I alluded to in the previous segment, constructed something that's pretty rare in the NBA. They have put together a group that is organically grown. Most of them have been drafted by the team or signed in some form of free agency by the team, like a John Conchar. They've grown up together quite literally, almost all of them. You know, Steven Adams here. Dylan Brooks is kind of in that mix. He was from the previous regime too. But you have to respect the way that they have organically and truly from within built the franchise. Kevin Durant is one of the top 3 to 5 players of the NBA when healthy. And I don't know many people that would disagree with that statement. However, there is a lot of baggage that now comes with Kevin Durant, fairly, unfairly, from OKC to Golden State, all these different places. Now the drama in Brooklyn. I'm not sure that what has organically been built in Memphis, what has gotten them to this point, could have withstood the addition of Kevin Durant. Maybe I'm wrong for that. Maybe I'm naive. You can give me the counterpoint here in a moment. I believe that while a trade could still be there to make the Grizzlies better, OG Anunoby of the Toronto Raptors, for example, if he were actually available, I think that would have made more sense for Memphis than acquiring a Kevin Durant. Obviously, Durant on the floor would be a tremendous addition. I'm concerned about the Grizzlies standard that they have spent a lot of sweat equity building up in time. What the arrival of a KD type to the Grizzlies would have meant for this core that, again, one of the youngest in the NBA and just got younger over this offseason.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's an interesting core, and you mentioned why. You know, I will counter that point there, and that's because it's a young core. They just got younger in the off season, and I will say this, and I've said this time and time again as well. With the price that Kevin Durant was going for, it's tough. I don't think the Grizzlies, you know, were out of their minds to say, hey, look, we're gonna stay right here, and if you don't take XYZ, we're not going to offer up Desmond Bane or Jaren Jackson Jr. It's exactly what the Grizzlies should have done. But you wonder, you know, you talk about young cores in the NBA, and yes, the Grizzlies have one of the better young cores. I've been on the record saying that time and time again. The difference is the Grizzlies aren't the only really good young core in the NBA right now. The NBA talent is insane. I think we all can agree that the talent right now is on another level. You just run through a few young cores that come in mind. New Orleans.
We'll start with the Boston Celtics. They were just in the NBA Finals.
There you go. Boston Celtics. Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, Grant Williams. We're talking guys, 25 and under?
Time Lord, Robert Williams.
Williams.
They got some talent, no doubt.
Yeah. And you go from there with the Cleveland Cavaliers. Started the season as a top 3 seed before injuries kicked in. Darius Garland, Jared Allen, Evan Mobley looking like a young Anthony Davis. New Orleans Pelicans will have Brandon Ingram, Zion Williamson, and you know, Herbert Jones, who was arguably the best defensive rookie in the NBA this past season. The Grizzlies aren't the only great young core. Each of those teams that I just mentioned feel like their young cores can take those same type jumps. What separates you is adding that veteran complement to those young cores. And although the price was outrageous, Joe, this may have been the Grizzlies' chance to add that type of player.
I see your point. I do think, and we've talked about this, I don't know if it was on an episode, it might have been off the stream. The Rudy Gobert trade kind of blew up the market, right? Like the fact that a Rudy Gobert, he gets a bad rep, okay? He is an excellent regular season player. If you love Jonas Valanciunas, you should really love Rudy Gobert, all right? So that's kind of my take on that. Jonas Valanciunas, excellent regular season player. Rudy Gobert is a better regular season player in terms of what he brings to the table. Postseason, maybe you have a conversation, you have a debate. But in the regular season, the Timberwolves are going to be pretty stout because of that acquisition. I think that you're right. They do need a veteran presence at some point. I wonder how much of the Jaren Jackson Jr. injury that the team continues to say isn't a big deal and Jaren continues to say isn't a big deal. And I know you'll have some insight into that as we get closer to media day in a month and training camp and all those things get underway. I'm interested to read your reporting on that as it comes. I wonder how much of that played into some of maybe this being a plan B, right? Like if Jaren was healthy, if they knew for a fact that opening night Jaren Jackson Jr. was going to be there, do they go more hard, not necessarily for Kevin Durant even, but for a veteran presence to try to make them take that next step? Because if Jaren Jackson Jr. misses the first 2 months of the season, that's what, 24, 26 games? That's a pretty substantial chunk of your regular season. And you're looking at not necessarily a lost year, obviously, but there are other aspects in place that maybe didn't make it the right time to push in a lot of those chips. So I wonder how much the Jaren injury had to do with that. I'm curious to see what they do. Because again, the Grizzlies don't operate like a contending team, right? That's not their MO right now. They are still making moves like a rebuilding team. Again, they got younger, Damichael. They didn't get older. They didn't go out and acquire, aside from Danny Green, but Danny Green barely counts. He's not going to be able to play until January, February at the earliest. He is the only guy on the roster who's over the age of 30. I think he's the only guy on the roster over the age of 28, depending on when Steven Adams' birthday.
Steven Adams just turned 29. Yep.
There you go. Okay, so he's the only guy on the roster over the age of 29. Thank you for that. So, again, they don't act like a contender. They look like a contender. They sound like a contender. Clearly, they are a contender. Vegas still sees them as a contender. They're one of the top 10 teams in terms of odds to win the NBA championship.
Right.
But they don't act like it. When do they start acting like it? A team that acts like it goes and gets Kevin Durant. The fact that we were so unsure of this actually being real, maybe that helps kind of put this into perspective in terms of how they view themselves.
Yeah, and it's an interesting situation because of that, Joe. But I think at the end of the day, it is a young roster. It is a roster that is taking its shape at the same time. They are filling each of their positions of needs. David Roddy and Jake LaRavia filled those needs off of the bench for those versatile wings. The starting lineup is pretty much set in stone right now. You have a couple players you can dangle here and there. Tyus Jones, as your backup point guard. They're pretty set from that perspective. So from an age standpoint, they are young. You mentioned Jaren Jackson Jr. as well. I think with Jaren Jackson Jr., the thing is the Grizzlies, from all accounts, and from Jaren Jackson Jr., from John Morant, from everyone I've talked to around there, the sentiment is they're not too worried. I said that I think, he could even come back before Christmas. A lot of people threw out January, and I talked, with a doctor, and I'll talk about this on a future episode as well, just where a doctor gave me just more insight in terms of the return to play process for him. And I think, given that clarity, I think the outlook for Jaren Jackson Jr. is a lot brighter. And with that being said, that's why the Grizzlies aren't super aggressive. And that's why when I was in Vegas, Zach Kleiman said, hey, look, we're making calls. This was in reference to after Jaren Jackson Jr. got hurt. They're making calls, but they're not going to do anything stupid. Why aren't they going to do anything stupid? Because they still have Brandon Clark who can step in. And they just drafted two rookies in David Roddy and Jake LaRavia that they're really high on.
And they should be, right? They should be high on those guys. They have earned a heat check. I think I've called it that throughout the summer. They've earned a John Conchar extension heat check. They've earned, look at how we've developed almost every single player that's come into our system these last 3 years, heat check. They deserve that. in my opinion. And they have given us very little reason to not trust them. Even their swings and misses are minimal swings and misses. You and I haven't had a chance to go down the Jay Crowder rabbit hole yet. Maybe we don't even need to. I don't want to hear Justice Winslow and Jay Crowder, that was a massive failure, because it wasn't. Jay Crowder stunk, all right? And the fact is that was an investment. That was an investment in trying to find a guy that could have been a good fit that didn't work out, right? Sometimes you swing and miss. They gave up very minimal things in that process. So even their failures are not necessarily drastic failures. They're still contenders sitting here today, even with Melton being gone, even with Anderson being gone, even with the Jaren Jackson Jr. injury. The smart money out in Vegas tells you that this is a team that should be in the top 8 to 10 in the NBA. And if you're in the top 8 to 10 in the NBA, you're probably a contender for the NBA championship if things break a certain way for you. Damichael, I just mentioned that the Grizzlies are a contender for the NBA Finals according to betting lines. You know how I know that, Damichael? BetOnline.net. That's how I know. It's the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. Find all your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all sports wagering information, from live in-game betting, scores, podcasts. It all has you covered. Head on to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action that is happening right now. There's somewhere in the world, Damichael, a game, an event, something that you can place a bet on. Go check it out over at BetOnline, where the game starts. Damichael, we head into this final segment, and I'm really thinking, we talked about the culture earlier. We talked about how it is a place where I don't know that I'm ready for them to test that. We didn't get as much into the actual play on the court, which I think is difficult to make an argument. You kind of countered that with the veteran point. You're exactly right. Adding a Kevin Durant would have made them a better basketball team in terms of play. The Grizzlies are still very much playing the long game, as we kind of alluded to there. What comes next for the Memphis Grizzlies? We talked about this a little bit, but I really want to dive deep into it with you here, because I am convinced that they have to do something at some point. I don't think they can just keep adding rookies and adding young players. And, Ja Morant is eventually going to want to see not necessarily more help, because he has Desmond Bane and he has Jaren Jackson Jr. They've built a good, strong relationship together. But as I mentioned in the previous segment to Michael, they don't act like a contender. They have not made a single trade in the front office that is a trade that you look at it and say, yep, Memphis is going all in. If it's not now, Damichael, which again, as we've mentioned, maybe that makes sense because of Jaren's injury and the kind of transition. They're going to have to play different basketball in terms of scoring, which we talked about on the previous episode. If not now, when? What comes next for these Grizzlies as the regular season approaches? Because again, Damichael, you're going to be a media day in like a month. It's not that far away. What comes next for them?
Yeah, it's a lot of ways that I think they're going to break this down, Joe. For one, there's a ripple effect that we just mentioned earlier that's about to kind of shuffle through the NBA. Donovan Mitchell is your new Kevin Durant. Not player, but just in terms of he is the hair right now, in terms of now league execs everywhere want to know what's going to happen with Donovan Mitchell. How does that impact the Memphis Grizzlies? Because the Memphis Grizzlies have zero need for Donovan Mitchell. Oh, there is a direct tie-in here. Well, let me explain. I did a story also that you can go check out on commercialappeal.com as well.
Very good. I enjoyed reading it.
Thank you, Joe. And the story kind of explained that now Donovan Mitchell, who the Knicks are very highly interested in, could be traded. And once he's traded, that creates a big opening, because if you look at the Utah Jazz's roster, a lot of veteran players on that roster, Joe, and Utah is going to go into full rebuild mode. We're talking players like Patrick Beverley, Mike Conley. Why would they need to keep those two guys? But I'll continue. Jordan Clarkson is on the roster. I think that's someone they'll potentially keep. But you got Rudy Gay, Bojan Bogdanovic. The list goes on. A lot of veteran guys and interesting fits for the Grizzlies. I think in that piece on the Commercial Appeal, I highlighted 3 players. Bogdanovic being one of them, Malik Beasley, who was just traded from the Timberwolves, and a former Grizzly, but not Mike Conley. So I think the Donovan Mitchell situation now takes center court, Joe. But outside of that, I don't think the Grizzlies are going to be super aggressive from the free agent market because they could have been doing that, right? I think what the ripple effects are in the Donovan Mitchell situation in Utah directly impacts Memphis. And if they want to get a little aggressive from a trading perspective,
they could get Beasley fairly easily, I think. And if they traded Danny Green, I don't know that they'd have to give up, aside from draft capital. I don't think they'd have to give up much else. I think that would fit salary-wise. So I like the Beasley. That was the one that really stood out to me that you wrote about. Bogdanovich has been kind of a popular guy on Grizzlies Twitter. Matt Hardlicka, who is a friend of mine going all the way back to the GBB days, he's really big onto Bogdanovich, and I think that there's value there. I like that idea. He just, again, you're looking for guys that kind of fit the mold, right? I'm not saying Malik Beasley has the mental toughness or the mental makeup of John Morant. I know that Bogdanovich doesn't, and he certainly doesn't fit in terms of age. So I think that is part of what they're trying to do. They're not going to add guys that don't fit with what their vision is. So Beasley among the Jazz makes the most sense. I think you could even go bigger than that, though, Damichael. I think you can look at it and say, let's make this a 3-team kind of party, right? Let's make this a 4-team kind of party. The New York Knicks could have some assets that the Grizzlies could be interested in. Maybe you work in a team like the Miami Heat who are trying to add some talent, and maybe they are interested in a Mike Conley. I don't know why they would be. They have Kyle Lowry, but they, there were rumors that they'd be interested in Kyrie. The Los Angeles Lakers. The Lakers are trying to add talent around LeBron James and Anthony Davis. Mike Conley makes a ton of sense in Los Angeles. Can you imagine Conley just hanging out on the perimeter as LeBron's creating off the dribble? That's going to be Mike's best dream come true if that were to come to fruition. So there are ways for the Grizzlies to get involved. And again, that's another argument for not pushing in all the chips for Kevin Durant, because now you can let the other folks, the other houses of cards kind of collapse, and you can be there to pick up the pieces. You could be there to try to swing in and add a player at a cost that's either fair or even a bit below market value because of what other teams are trying to do. That has been their MO in terms of drafting in particular, but that's essentially how they got Steven Adams. I mean, Steven Adams had a career year, you could argue, last season, and they did it in the process of moving up into the lottery in the NBA draft. So they have a history of finding ways to take advantage, not necessarily of circumstances, because I think the Pelicans were happy with the end result of that trade. Valanciunas has played well for New Orleans. I don't know that anybody lost that deal. But Memphis knows and is very opportunistic. I could see them continuing to be that ultimate opportunist and trying to work their way into some of these larger deals to pick and prod and poke some other players or even more draft capital out of teams in exchange for an expiring contract, in exchange for a little bit of cap space down the road. Memphis has a lot of foresight in that way.
Yeah, and I can see that with more than any player. The Danny Green situation stands out. Overall, though, I've talked about this and I've wrote about it as well on the Commercial Appeal site. The Grizzlies are in a roster crunch. And, the Grizzlies have, I believe, 17 rostered players right now, 19 total when you factor in the two-way contracts and Vince Williams and Kenneth Lofton. But 17 players eventually will be cut down to 15. That's no big deal right now. I mean, they have the entire preseason right before regular season starts to figure that out. That's not a big deal right now. But if you look at those players that the Grizzlies can choose from, all of them, you can make an argument as to why they belong on the roster. Killian Tilly is probably one of the biggest, cut candidates, I would say, at this point. But I watched Killian Tilly shoot the ball in Vegas. And let me tell you, Joe, he wasn't missing, out in practice. The stroke looked good.
Stroke.
And he's someone I really think could see minutes. We talk about those versatile wings, the 3 and the 4. So how can he play in that role, given a full offseason of health and working out in Las Vegas with the Summer League team and things like that? Dylan Brooks, full season for him. You talk about an expiring that's expendable. Zaire Williams' emergence could make Dylan Brooks expendable in a way, but the Grizzlies are investing a lot in him. That's another guy that was out there in Vegas. He was out there patting those guys on the back. So the roster is stacked right now. You just extended John Conchar, who I would have said was actually one of those candidates at the bottom of the roster before, the Grizzlies extended him. Joe, you just got a lot of options to choose from. And that could impact the trade market as well, because the Grizzlies could throw a couple of those guys into a trade instead of releasing them and actually get value back in the same way. So that's something I would watch for, as well as the Utah situation.
Especially if they view them as more long-term fits, right? I do think that's an important thing to point out. The long-term goal, as we've discussed, John Morant, Desmond Bane, Jaren Jackson Jr., barring a future Kevin Durant possible-esque kind of trade, those are your three dudes. Building around them is the priority moving forward. And we'll continue to talk about that this and every episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Thank you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen every single day. Next episode, next time we're together, Damichael's going to do a great job continuing to break things down in terms of young cores, what comes next heading into the season. I'm sure we'll start doing some roster breakdown stuff, how the race for those 15 roster spots will play out, but that will all come in due time. For your second listen, after you listen to Locked On Grizzlies, you definitely need to get up to date on the latest news and rumors in the NBA in just 30 minutes every day with Locked On NBA. I wonder what they're going to be talking about for the next couple of episodes. Guessing it has to do with Kevin Durant and the renewal of vows in Brooklyn between himself and the Nets. Check out Locked On NBA, your daily NBA update in just 30 minutes. I'm looking forward to continuing to record these shows with Damichael. Thank you, Damichael, so much for your time. Anything you want to leave the wonderful folks with?
Now, I think, this Kevin Durant situation played out exactly how many of us thought it was as the days went on and on and on. Once you saw that price tag with Rudy Gobert go up, and then, remember when Phoenix first was rumoring this, they were asking for Devin Booker. Brooklyn isn't playing when it came to that. And once I saw that and, what they wanted from Miami and things like that, it always seemed unlikely. But I am a big fan of players signing the contracts. And, unless you're in a super disgruntled situation, I don't know Kevin Durant's personal situation, but I think it's good for basketball parity. I love the fact that you can make an argument for about 5 teams in the East right now. You can make an argument for about 5 teams in the West. That makes basketball fun, and I think it's setting up for a great season. And the Grizzlies are going to be involved in that conversation, Joe.
The Grizzlies are in the mix, and considering all the continued flexibility that they have to be in the mix at this stage of what they are as a roster, that's really the best of both worlds in terms of not sacrificing your future while your present still being very much a positive place to be. For Damichael, I'm Joe Mullinax. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. We'll catch you next time.